So let me introduce our respondent for the Bishop Hwang's speech. LINDSAY BROWN. He studied modern history in Oxford and theology in Paris. He has been privileged to serve the Lord in the student world for over 40 years. He's still doing that one, yeah. During which time he has served as International General Secretary of IFES. And then he was the International Director of a Lausanne movement, particularly during the Lausanne III Cape Town Congress. He has enjoyed visiting and speaking in student gathering in over 120 countries. You know, as you see his career, I think LINDSAY is one of the few to understand what's going on in churches globally, including Asian churches. Many of you have met him already as he travels globally. So I'm also his good friend of mine. So we have the right person to look at the issues in the majority world from the perspective of the West. So let's welcome LINDSAY again with our warm Asian welcoming by showing our gesture in this way, hugging. Let's give our big hug to LINDSAY. Okay, please, LINDSAY. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chulho, and greetings, brothers and sisters from Wales, my home country from where I'm speaking. I'm honored by your kind invitation to respond to Bishop Hwa Young's paper on megatrends in the church in Asia, in which he traces the shift in the center of gravity from the West to the majority world. I think this is an exceptional paper, clear, lucid, holistic, succinct, and sharp. I'd like to recommend its publication and its wide circulation within and beyond Asia, and urge its careful study by groups of church leaders, as well as its wide discussion in theological and Bible colleges and mission agencies, and even in home groups. As Hwa Young says, there's been a huge shift in the last 100 years in the composition of the global evangelical church. One statistic to demonstrate this will suffice. At the World Missions Conference in Edinburgh in Scotland in 1910, 95% of the participants came from the Western church. Only 5% came from the majority world. At a similar conference 100 years later in Cape Town, in South Africa in November 2010, at which both Hwa Young and I were present, together with participants from 190 countries, 65% of the participants were from the majority world and 35% only from the Western world. This statistic alone demonstrates the enormous shift in the center of gravity of the evangelical church globally in only 100 years. I'm in wholehearted agreement with many of the points which Hwa Young has made in his presentation. But by way of response, perhaps then the most helpful comments I can make because of my background as an historian, are to reflect on the reasons why the church grew in the West, particularly in Europe, and suggest how we might learn from both the strengths of the church as well as our weaknesses and failures, in the hope that you don't repeat them in Asia. As one historian has said, if we don't learn lessons from the reasons for the advance of the church in the past and its failures, we run the risk of forgetting the benefits or the causes of growth, and also repeating the mistakes that we have made. So I'd like to do this briefly by looking at three key periods in European church history, which offer us principles for today. The periods are firstly AD 30 to 330, the early church. Secondly, the 16th century, covering the European Reformation. And lastly, the 19th and 20th centuries, focusing on missionary expansion and decline. Firstly, the early church. In answer to the question, how did the early church grow from a despised minority into a significant and influential body by the 4th century? One great historian, German historian Adolf Harnack, simply said, it grew because the early church outlived and out-argued the pagans. In other words, it grew because of a combination of their godly lives allied to especially the building of attractive communities, alongside an articulate defense of the uniqueness and power of the gospel over against alternative pagan worldviews. They emphasized, in other words, both the proclamation and the demonstration of the gospel. Now, a seminal book published in the last 20 years entitled The Rise of Christianity by Professor Rodney Stark has brilliantly traced the reasons for the growth of the early church in Europe and North Africa, especially. They revolved around the uniqueness, power, and authenticity of the gospel message, allied to the engagement of the early church with people in the surrounding cultures. Stark argues in particular that the early church proved to be attractive societally for at least 2 major reasons. Firstly, in the context of a time of frequent pandemics, most notably in the periods around 150 AD and 250 to 265 AD, possibly when measles came for the first time to Europe, perhaps as many as 1/3 of the population in most of the major cities of the Roman Empire died because of the pandemics. However, believers reached out to the suffering and dying, many of whom responded by embracing to the gospel. Even a pagan Roman emperor, Julian, stated that if the pagans could not match the believers in their compassion for the sick, suffering, and dying, that the church would take over the pagan world. Incidentally, many elders and leaders of the churches died as they gathered sick people and nursed them, risking their own lives as they came in contact with the pandemics. There was a huge spike or growth in the church during the time, especially of those 2 major pandemics. Perhaps that's a lesson for us today. In addition, interestingly, Stark argues that the message of the church proved especially attractive in this first period to women, because this has nothing to do with feminism, okay? But these early believers took a firm stand on at least 4 issues related to women. The widespread practice of abortion, the church stood against. The killing of female children as male children were preferred. Thirdly, resistance to the practice of young adolescent girls being forced to marry much older, mature men. Often elders stood against it. And fourthly, the acceptance in the cultures of the time that when a husband died, his family, especially his brothers, were free to take over all his possessions in preference to his widow and children. In this context, you can understand the Apostle James's exhortation in James chapter 1, that true religion is to care for the widows and the orphans. In other words, church leaders took a strong stance on all these things, which led to many women, both highborn and poor, being attracted to the gospel message. Now you can see an image, I think, of Stark's book if you want to try to get hold to it. But allied to this demonstration of Christian love was, in addition, the fact that God raised up many gifted defenders of the gospel who were able to articulate the truth of the gospel in the public sphere, both in Europe and North Africa. These included John Chrysostom, the golden-tongued preacher, Origen, Clement of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Athanasius, he defended the deity of Christ, Augustine, and others who served and lived in Europe and North Africa. I'm reminded of Hua Yong's view that to succeed, the church has to be both rooted in scripture and ready to defend it, as well as being culturally relevant. So from this period, we see a defense of the gospel allied to an engagement with the culture proved to be decisive contributory factors in the growth of the early church. You could say that proclamation and demonstration characterized the mission of the early church. Today, many people would call that integral mission. Sometimes we may have a tendency to retreat from engagement with the world. This was not the case with the first believers. I'm reminded of the brilliant quote by John Stott, who said, "The calling of the church is to be morally distinct without being socially segregated." And sometimes we've confused the two, cutting ourselves off from the culture. Now, secondly, if we fast forward to the 16th century, we can see the impact of what became called the Reformation period on both the growth of the church and the transformation of European cultures. Under the leadership of Martin Luther and John Calvin, I would suggest that the 16th century European church succeeded in three ways. Firstly, they rediscovered the essence of the gospel, especially the much neglected and primary Christian doctrines of justification by grace, which incidentally has been rediscovered in every major revival in history, the trustworthiness of Scripture, and the priesthood of all believers, all of which had been obscured within the Roman Catholic tradition in the Middle Ages in the previous 1,000 years. Secondly, this rediscovery led to the reformation of European cultures, because Luther and Calvin both taught Christian doctrines, but also sought to apply biblical truth and the lordship of Christ to every sphere of life, including the world of education, the visual arts, science, which led to the vast expansion of university education, great expansion in the education of women, a new view of vocation, the birth of liberal democracy, the growth of religious toleration, and so much more. Some historians have even argued that Calvin, because of his teaching on money and stewardship, was influential in laying the foundations for the creation of the Swiss banking system, from which we benefit today. I've traced all this in a recent book just published called Into All the World, the Missionary Vision of Luther and Calvin. In other words, they developed the concept of the Christian mind, by which I mean an attempt to apply biblical truth and the lordship of Christ to every sphere of life, including the realm of ideas. Rather like those early apologists, they exhibited a concern to expand the lordship of Christ, both through the proclamation of the gospel to the ends of the earth as they knew it, which was mostly in Europe, but also in every sphere of life, including the realm of ideas. They espoused both the proclamation of the gospel and the development of the biblical worldview as they attempted to apply scripture to every sphere of life. They saw no separation between doctrine and practice, between doctrine, praxis, engagement, and mission. So that one of their successors, Abraham Kuyper, as a consequence argued, there's not one single centimeter in human existence to which Christ, who is Lord of all, does not point and say that is mine. As a consequence, the impact on the continent of Europe was profound. It led to the creation of the modern world. The Reformation shaped and created modern Europe, and it is impossible to understand all that developed in Europe in the next 500 years without the Reformation. Thirdly, however, they had a renewed vision for evangelism and mission outside of their own culture. Many historians and missiologists unfortunately have minimized and missed this. But if we take Calvin as an example, under his ministry, evangelicals in France grew to at least 2 million out of a population of 20 million soon after his death. Luther's doctrines spread to Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. Diaspora missions, spending time studying under both of them in Geneva and Wittenberg, went out all across Europe. Some even traveled to Brazil, where they lost their lives. Some historians argue that the Reformers' teaching profoundly impacted William Carey and others to whom Hua Yung referred later in India. Therefore, in answer to the question, why did the Reformation have such a profound impact in Europe, lasting for several hundred years? My answer would be because the Reformers had a beautiful balance of rediscovering the essence of the gospel, reforming the culture, and recovering the missionary vision. All three came together, which makes for a potent missionary church. Hence, we saw Reformation and many revivals in different parts of the continent. All three must come together. If we only focus on doctrine, the church can become inward-looking and moribund. If we only focus on taking the gospel to the ends of the earth without applying biblical truth to every sphere of life and without having the rootedness of sound doctrine, our message can become superficial. But note, if we only try to reform a culture without the undergirding of biblical doctrine, a Christian worldview, and an evangelistic heart, we will lose direction and rootedness and go off at a tangent. The impact of the Reformation lasted so long, for several hundreds of years, because these three emphases came together at the same time. And if we want to have a deep, penetrating impact on our cultures, we actually need to copy and learn from their examples or these principles. And I hope then it will happen across Asia in our cultures. Finally, if we fast forward to the 1800s, we can see that it was again a period of great expansion and the initiation of the modern missionary movement. In many ways, it had its roots in the ministry of John Wesley and his supporters, including some of the people Hua Yung referred to, Franke, Spener in Germany, Zinzendorf would be others. So the 1800s was a period of missionary enterprise with Protestant missionaries traveling not only all over Europe, but then to the ends of the earth. However, even during that period, we can see the seeds of decline from about 1850 onwards. This is because powerful alternative views began to be expounded as a result of that period, which came to be called the European Enlightenment, a false term, which essentially moved God from the center of European thinking to the periphery, to be replaced by man at the center of the world. A secularist view began to be developed, which sought to portray what life could be like without the presence or intervention of a sovereign God. Some believers were even seduced by this view, which led to the desupernaturalization of God and the Christian faith, and a loss of confidence in the scriptures, the two things together. Two competing views addressing the desire for human freedom began to develop. The one issuing from the Bible argued for the provision of freedom within a framework provided by the scriptures for finite, fallen human beings. The other argued that human beings should be free of all constraints without any restriction to do whatever they wanted, and certainly without any reference to God. In the midst of a great missionary enterprise, therefore, which incidentally also led Christians to contributing to the abolition of the slave trade, the birth of trade unions, labor laws, and so much else, the church was faced by the growing challenge of the Enlightenment secularist worldview. Sadly, in the second half of the 1800s, even during a period when some revivals were occurring, we had two in Wales in that period, even while that was happening, church leaders often, instead of confronting the emerging secular worldviews, retreated from engaging with it into a pietistic corner. We should have learned from the early church apologists and from the Reformation leaders of the vital importance of both proclaiming the gospel in public and articulating the superiority of the biblical worldview in the culture, in universities, in media, and in all other spheres of society. We didn't. We retreated. And as a consequence, over a period of time, when the Bible came under attack from liberal scholarship, we did a poor job of defending it. We embraced alternative critical worldviews, retreated into pietism, lost courage, so that within a short period of time, political and other leaders began to say to us, you can worship on Sunday, but keep it as a private affair, for you have nothing to say to us in other spheres of society or the workplace. We realized, even in recent decades, rather late, that it's important to expose the weaknesses and inadequacies of other worldviews in public, and as the door opens, proclaim the gospel into the vacuum. That's what the early apologists did, and what Luther and Calvin did. We have much to learn from the contribution which believers made in the early centuries and during the Reformation in expounding both a biblical worldview and proclaiming the gospel. It's not either or. I notice one danger in some cultures is people trying to apply scriptures to other spheres of life, but they're not preaching the gospel. They're not engaged in evangelism. We must do both in order for the church to penetrate every area of society. It is somewhat disconcerting if Hua Yung's report is accurate from that Indian brother, that there appear to be few public apologists who are able to proclaim the gospel and articulate the biblical worldview in an Asian cultural context. I don't know if that is accurate, but if it is the case, I recommend you deal with the challenge urgently in order to avoid your missionary endeavors being derailed at home and further afield. Please learn from our mistakes and learn from the lessons of the early church fathers and from the reformers. The confident articulation and defense of the biblical gospel and the biblical worldview in the public sphere is central to the calling of the church. Please pray for us as we seek to be faithful to that calling, and we will also pray for you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you so much for your response. It was such a thoughtful presentation. So you can also find Lindsay's full script in our website. So if I summarize Lindsay's advice to us by quoting what he said at the last sentence, this is what he said. He advised us: the confident articulation and the defense of the biblical gospel and the biblical worldview in the public sphere is central to the calling of the church. Let's don't forget this. Thank you for Lindsay. Okay. Now we will have a breakout time. You can see the screens. I just read from the top. So top means that many people raise the same question. So what do new models of theological training that are rooted in the majority world and Asian culture look like in reality? Maybe Bishop Hua Yung can answer for these questions. Yeah.
I think if you notice what I was trying to say was that many of us have started with the Western models. We have not moved away from the Western model. Hang on, excuse me one moment. Right. And consequently, that's what's troubling me. So where we need to think about new models is what I was splitting for, where we need to think about, how should I say? We see some new models in a sense, in places like where there's been a lot of church growth, like in the Chinese house churches or in the Indian grassroots churches, I think if the training can be done together with the actual ministry, that would be one way forward. Now, incidentally, I'm a Methodist, for those of you who don't know. And in fact, when early Methodism started, John Wesley did not have preachers. He had to train many of them, his own preachers, many of them who had no education. And that's exactly how he started. He trained people who were on the ground. And in fact, he did a training and he integrated training and a ministry together. So those early Methodist ministers had to go through 4 years of training minimum. I think that's what's the pattern that's being followed by some of our grassroots churches. I think that's one thing. I think we need to think much more. The other thing that I think we need to think about is, quite apart from the issues I really raised, is whether we can begin to, if we are serious about integrating theological training to, theological studies together with ministry training, we need to look at the medical schools much more closely. There they managed to integrate academic training together with the actual practice of medicine. Now, a lot of our seminaries send our students out for field work, but I've worked long enough in seminaries to know that a lot of field education training is actually not adequate at all. What happens is that most of the past students who are sent out for field work are actually used as cheap labor by the churches to act as assistant pastor, but there's no proper integration. And I think that if we're going to move away from the academic model that's being used, we need to give some thought to these areas.
Okay, thank you. So, Lindsay, can you add some on this question? The three questions is all related. Can you add some advice from the historical church point of view? What kind of things we should not miss when we have our own theological training program from Asia Church?
I don't think this is my area of expertise, but I see that in European theological institutions, very few of them actually are providing teaching and modeling on evangelism and mission, which surprises me. One major college in Britain, because of financial problems, has just been told by its board to release one professor, and the one they released was the professor for evangelism, which says a lot about the college, probably. I think from what Hua Yung says, a balance of classroom education and also exposure to good human models is crucial. What strikes me, I think Chandapilla raised this in his book about Jesus, the master trainer, that the way that Jesus equipped the disciples was that he spent time with them. He retreated to be with them. And I think often we need to catch things from good models. I remember once asking Samuel Escobar, who is, as Hua Yung said, a great missiologist. I said to him, how do you learn, Samuel? Is it through reading books, through the classroom, or something else? And he said, the primary way I learn, this is a great missiologist, is doing what we're doing now, Lindsay, dialoguing and debating one-to-one. And that's why I recommend with Hua Yung's paper that the best way to deal with that is to disseminate it and to try to get church leaders not to be threatened by the challenges, but to dialogue humbly and graciously and ask whether these things are true, whether they need to be fine-tuned, what we can learn, what we need to repent of. It's by spending time with godly models, which clearly Wesley established in his style, alongside some input and teaching, formal teaching. That kind of balance is really vital, whereas one of the weaknesses of the West is we move too much to a lecture style delivery of formal material. So there's an imbalance there which needs to be corrected.
Okay, can we see the other questions? Thank you. Yeah, this is another question. Is the center of gravity just about the number, or is it also about the influence and power? In each case, is it really true that center of gravity has moved from west to a majority world? This is the question. Yeah, maybe both of you can answer on this question. Yeah.
Lindsay, why don't you go first?
Yeah.
No, I'll let you go first, Vayon.
That's a
okay,
good tactic.
Before I go into it, I just want to make one comment. Please don't get me wrong in what I say about theological education, that I don't think we need good, sound academic teaching in theology. I think we do need that. There's too much heresies in our churches today. But my plea is, how can we combine good, sound theological teaching with helping a student to emerge as a person of prayer and a person who knows how to do evangelism, church planting, pastoral work? That's my plea. All right. So, so please don't go away saying that I'm trying to run down theological education as it is. That's not my. Okay, coming to the question of that. The question is the center of gravity of the church in terms of the West, in terms of numbers, have moved from the West into the majority world. But the person who raised the question rightly pointed out the center of influence today are still largely in the West. Denominational headquarters, seminaries offering PhD programs, mission agency with plenty of money, publication. You go to any book, for example, you go to a bookshop in my country, 90% of the books are published in Britain and in America. You listen to the music. I complained last night. I'm sorry about this for those of you who like music the last 3 nights. I said, last 3 nights, when we're supposed to be Asian conference, we had Western music on our worship. So the influence is very strong, overwhelming. And we need to break away from it. So the influence is still there. So unfortunately, that's the case. So we have to consciously make a break. So for example, I say to people, I say, when you send your students to do PhD, even okay, in the West, they still are the best institutions. But why are you sending them to do just Old Testament studies, New Testament studies, theology? And then when they write on church history, you insist that they write on something about Western church history. Can't they write a thesis on their own church history in their own country? And can't they be going to do PhD studies, not necessarily in the traditional Western seminary areas, theological disciplines, but can they be writing Buddhism, Hinduism, Chinese culture, Islam, and write and begin to out that develop a good apologetics, like people like the early church fathers, Irenaeus, and people like Tertullian, who was able to out-argue the pagan philosophers because they had first mastered pagan philosophy. My question about the Indian friend who said he cannot think of anyone who could stand toe-to-toe with the Hindu intellectuals was exactly the point I was trying to make. We need to produce men and women who can stand toe-to-toe with these Hindus, philosophers, Buddhist philosophers, most Islamic scholars, and be able to argue and show why we believe Jesus Christ has the answer. I think that's the sort of thing that we do. But you're not going to produce those scholars if you only insist that they go and study Western systematic theology. And all you read is Moltmann, Tannenberg, Karlbach, etc. So that's my first comment. My second comment is this: Western theology will remain very parochial if we don't push them. Professor Andrew Walsh made one comment. He says, you go to study do a PhD in African studies in any major Western universities. One of the things that you got to understand about Africa is the church in Africa. So you go to study African studies, but you must understand about African Christianity. But the problem, he says, you go to any Western seminary to study theology, they don't teach you anything about the church in the non-Western world. He says, don't you realize that doesn't Western theologians will remain very parochial. They remain very close-minded. They only think that the answers come out of the West. And this is where we need a challenge. I think I've said enough. Lindsay, please.
Okay.
I do think it's important for people to become aware of their own history, if the church has existed in their country or their region for quite some time. And in fact, I make it a practice whenever I travel to anywhere in the world, I encourage the student movements to write up their own history and see it as part of the growth of the work in their region of the world, because then you can draw on the lessons. If somebody is writing even a 50-page history, it doesn't have to be 250 pages, but I think reflecting on the roots and the growth of the work in a country or a region and lessons learned from it is a very healthy development. And other literature, of course, comes from that. In terms of the question about influence and power, I always feel uncomfortable with the word power in relation to global leadership in the church. Influence is probably a better word. All I would say here is that it takes time historically for influence to shift from one region to another. If you asked, for example, in the first 300 years, who were the great leaders in the church in the year 300 AD, you wouldn't have had any Northern European names or North American or Asian. They would have been Southern Europeans and North Africans. That's where the influence, and if you like, the power lay. It often is the case that when there is a shift in terms of the number of believers in a country or a region also, it takes decades, sometimes a generation or two, for us to see God raising up a new generation of leaders who can think not only about the application of the gospel in their cultures, but have a word, something to say to the global church. And all I would say is that if I look back over 45 years in student ministry, in the early years, people like John Stott and even Billy Graham were perhaps influential global figures. I am seeing the emergence of more people in the non-Western world who are significant forces and voices for biblical Christianity. And they will be listened to in due course. I hear them even in European conferences. In the Welsh Evangelical Forum, we have somebody from another part of the world every year. So we've had Ajit Fernando, Ramesh Atala, a bishop from Jos in the last few weeks, Patrick Fung. The reality is people want to hear authoritative, authentic voices where these leaders speak with grace and humility, and their tone is important too. When you have such folks, people will always be attracted to hear them, but it takes time for growth in numbers to issue in growth in maturity and the formation of significant global figures. It's not primarily to do with money. Money is a factor, but those voices will be heard increasingly. I think we'll see it more in the next 20, 30 years as God raises up significant factors, leaders in other parts of the world. And for those people, as they begin to develop, the other thing would be, it's crucial to develop friendships with key leaders in other parts of the world. That's been my experience in IFS and to some extent in Lausanne. When you meet with leaders in other parts of the world, you are challenged to think afresh about your own perspective. And it's also easier to take critiques from voices in other parts of the world, from people who are humble friends. You can take a strong challenge from a friend. If someone is unknown and there's no contact, then it's more difficult.
Thank you.
So global gatherings are important too.
Right, thank you. Maybe we have we have maybe 5 minutes to left. So I have a question to both of you. It seems to me when I hearing your presentation, it seems to me both of you very much agree with each other's opinion. But is there any point that you would disagree or you want to balancing in some point of each other's points? Would you say? Can you say on that? To make this discussion more exciting. I want to see you just debate with certain point. I know you are very good friends. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we are very good friends, but
I think Lindsay and myself has got a slight difference of opinion on the place of the supernatural in Christianity. We have interacted briefly in our emails. I take the position where I think we need to return to the New Testament pattern, that the supernatural is not something extraordinary. I think Lindsay takes a slightly more cautious position. I don't know whether it's because he's such a strong reform man, but Lindsay, would you like to comment on that?
For me, it's more a question. Is God a supernatural God? Yes. Conversion is a supernatural event. It's probably the primary supernatural event. I remember being on OM in South Africa, going to a community where remarkable things were happening. They even talked of resurrections. I went back to the Lagos ship on which I was, and I said to my roommate, who was from Malaysia, and my Irish roommate, I've just seen somebody who said they were raised from the dead. What do you think of that? And they said, that's nothing, Lindsay. You've been raised from the dead too. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, and look at you now. So there is the danger of playing down the supernatural act of conversion, because I often hear Christians saying, I've never seen anything supernatural in my life, to which I say, well, if you've become a Christian, that's a supernatural act of God. What about the experience of the supernatural in terms of overt miracles that Hua Yung speaks about? My question is simply that some people would argue that these events occur more frequently in the birth of a church or the early years of the life of a church. I don't have a conviction about that. It's just an observation that they often seem to be more plentiful in times of initial birth and growth of a church. Do they still happen in the West today? They actually happen more than you think. I've just been reading something this morning, a PhD on supernatural miracles in the church in Wales, where I live. And there are many Christians of Pentecostal and charismatic backgrounds here. So, but my question is more in terms of the frequency of the overtly supernatural events. The other observation I would make is that the great church historian Kenneth Scott Latourette said that we have 6 weapons in our armament: evangelism, prayer, argument, community, and suffering. And the only observation I would say there is that God often uses our response to adversity to bring other people to faith as a powerful testimony. Very briefly, may I say, my only daughter died 34 years ago. My parents became believers, and my son, my only son, became a believer as a result of how they saw my wife and I respond to the loss of our daughter. When my son was baptized years later, they asked him in public, how did you become a Christian? He said, and he had never told me this, I watched my parents when my sister died, and I saw that they were not bitter against God. And in my parents' case, my father asked to see me just after her death and said, your mother and I want to be baptized. I said, you've got to become a Christian first. And I said, I've been a Christian for 20 years. Why is it taking you so long? And he said, well, I've seen so many charlatans in the church. But he said, Lindsay, you can't fake hope in the midst of adversity. You have it, and your mother and I want it. So we're ready. So after all those years of witness, what was powerful in their case, that doesn't diminish the fact that God does heal children of sicknesses or heal other people. He does. I don't know why he doesn't heal some, but when that doesn't happen, in terms of balance, all I would say don't forget the role of Christian testimony in response to suffering as a powerful testimony before the watching world.
Thank you.
I would just add this comment.
Sure.
And it's this that I'm glad for Lindsay's comment. And I think sometimes we in the majority world, when we talk about the supernatural, there are many groups that just overemphasize it. They talk about nothing but the supernatural, but their lives are in a mess. And they think that by having a so-called what they call anointing, the church will grow. It doesn't happen. The church will explode in the end. So I think having said that we need to recover the supernatural, Lindsay has rightly pointed out, we must never overemphasize it. What's the place of suffering, for example, and everyday Christian living? How does that impact other people's lives? We need to be able to combine the supernatural with the way we live. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lindsay and Hua Yong. Actually, I myself has a lot of questions after I hear from you, and then but we are out of time, so we need to finish our Q&A now. So thank you very much for your contribution and then answering the question.